But before we go anywhere else, it's time for our political panel. In the red corner, as it were, on the left-hand side of the fence, is former editor of the Labour List, Peter Edwards. Welcome, Peter. Peter's in the studio, by the way.
Good evening.
And also from the right side of the fence, it's political commentator Jason Reed. Good afternoon, Jason.
Good afternoon, Kevin.
Before we start our discussion, let's have a little listen or a little watch of the former Tory leader, William Hague, who reacted rather extraordinarily, really, to Andrea Leadsom joining the fray and saying it was time for the Prime Minister to go. Let's hear what Lord Hague had to say.
Such a letter from, again, a senior figure, Andrea Leadsom, is the fuse. The fuse is getting closer to the dynamite here, and it's speeding up. So I think that's just another indication the Conservative Party is moving faster towards a vote of confidence or no confidence.
Strong words from William Hague there, and there is definitely a feeling now in Westminster that the Prime Minister is in serious trouble. Phone call there. Peter, do you think he can wriggle out of this one?
Well, I certainly think the vote is nigh, even if the end is not nigh. Cast your mind back to Theresa May, who went through similar troubles and a confidence vote 3 or 4 years ago. One of her aides said subsequently, general rule was, whatever the number in the public domain of MPs who have sent letters demanding a leadership contest, the real number might be double that. So we know now there's about 29 have either sent a letter or called for Boris Johnson to go. So if that rough dictum is true, that would take us over 50. And Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, perhaps one of the most important people many of us have never heard of, think he needs 54 letters. So I'd imagine we're either on the brink or at the threshold now, but we won't know till Monday morning when Parliament returns.
And do you think he can wriggle off this one?
I think he will face a leadership contest. Will he win? Well, look, you know, there's this old adage, and it's not mine, but about the Tory MPs in Parliament being the most dishonest group of voters in the whole world. That's a little bit unkind, but it's very hard to predict. What I would say, though, is Theresa May had personal loyalty, David Cameron had personal loyalty, so did Blair and Brown in their own camps. I'm not sure there's a Boris camp in the Conservative Party in the Commons. There's a Brexiteer camp, and there's an anyone but Boris camp. So has he got the personal vote? And remember, if you're a minister, in the silence and privacy of the ballot box, you can cast your vote against Boris. It's not like going on TV or radio where you've got to toe the line.
What's extraordinary about Boris Johnson is that he tests the patience of the Tory party. I've never known a Tory leader to be so unpopular among so many Tories, particularly MPs, because he does seem to cause chaos wherever he goes. Jason, try to sum up for us why you think Boris is in so much trouble, and give us your opinion on whether or not he can Teflon-like live to fight another day.
I think he will live to fight another day. He's in a lot of trouble for sure, but I think he's in less trouble than a lot of people seem to think. There's a clear difference between what's happening with Boris Johnson and what happened with Theresa May. With Theresa May, after the disaster of the 2017 general election, the Tory party made it very clear she was never going to lead the Tories into another election ever again. She was a lame duck, and it was always clear that it was a question of when, not if, she had to go. With Boris Johnson, I think it's a little bit different. I think a majority of the Tory party still wants him to lead the Tories into the next election, whether that's next year or in 2024. And there is no organised campaign going on like there was with Theresa May to get these letters in. And so it's possible, I think it's still unlikely, but it's possible we will hit the magic number of 54 and have a vote in his leadership. But I think he will win that vote. And that, of course, means, according to Tory rules, that he is safe for another year. They cannot have another vote of no confidence. And I think in all likelihood, it's still pretty much a safe bet to say that Boris Johnson will be the Tory leader at the next election and will go on to win it.
I'm going to stick with you, Jason, on this. I mean, do you think that's a good idea? Because the Times last week had a poll saying that if he carries on like this, he's on course to lose 85 of the red wall seats and indeed even his own seat. I think if he called an election tomorrow, he'd be in big trouble.
He would, but a lot can change over the course of an election campaign. We've yet to see almost any policy from Labour, so it's hard to say what their election campaign would look like. But I think that the majority that he won in 2019, that 80-seat majority, was so huge. I think there have been very, very few cases in political history where any party has managed to overcome a huge gap like that in the space of just one election cycle. And so if we had some really charismatic, enthusiastic Labour leader who was stoking the masses and was really stoking up support, then it might be possible just about, but frankly, Keir Starmer is not that person, and he never will be that person. And so I think it's still pretty likely that we will have a Tory government after the next election, even if it's Boris Johnson at the helm, and even if it's a slightly smaller majority than they have now.
Well, Peter, that's not the prediction at the moment. Poll-wise, they're talking that at best Boris could hope for a hung parliament, some kind of split parliament that might actually allow Keir Starmer to form a government. But what is the feeling in the Labour camp? Is Boris Johnson now no longer electoral gold, but in fact electoral poison for the Tory party?
Well, I think the worry in Labour is perhaps not what Boris Johnson can do, but what the Tory party can do, because basically, as we were saying earlier, I'm afraid Boris Johnson's fate politically is out of his hands. It's going to be decided by those Tory backbenchers, whether they keep him or get rid of him. In terms of Labour, I think when you're in opposition, ultimately it's about the trajectory. So I think we've moved on from the chaos of the Corbyn years. Keir Starmer has decency, integrity. He's got more so-called big beasts back in the shadow cabinet. And as we were mentioning off air, he's made this huge gambit about quitting if he's fined by Durham. Very confident he won't be, so he'll stay on. So that plays to his existing strong point, which is about integrity. So for Labour, the trajectory is positive, but Labour have to remember Ed Miliband had a poll lead of about 10 points in austerity over David Cameron, who, whatever you think of him, came from a very wealthy background, but none of those things converted into anywhere near a general election victory for Ed Miliband. So if you keep that in mind and then think that Tories could swap their leader for a new one, it's definitely not a done deal for Labour.
And what about Keir Starmer, what Jason was saying? To be fair, it's a favourite refrain of people on the right. We're in good shape as long as Keir Starmer is the Labour leader, that he, in fact, is an electoral liability for the Labour Party. Do you think there's something in that? I mean, he should arguably be much further ahead in the polls right now, shouldn't he?
Well, last time I looked it up, he'd been between January and I think the start of May, he'd been ahead of every opinion poll bar one this entire calendar year. Going back to Keir Starmer's image, I think what's important is you need an image that is true and that is genuine. So I think for Labour, they won't worry about Keir Starmer appearing a bit dull at times. I don't think he is, but he's certainly not Tony Blair in jeans with a guitar with his shirt undone and so on and so on. He's a different type of personality, but I think playing to your strengths of integrity, seriousness, policy heft after both the chaos of Boris Johnson and the chaos of the Corbyn years is positive, because people know that ultimately Keir Starmer is presenting a genuine image of himself rather than a false image, and that's why I think Theresa May got in trouble, that people knew what her personal characteristics were, and then when she tried to pivot to something else, whether that was being a bit Brexity or dancing to ABBA at party conference, it didn't really fit with who she is.
Fair enough. Now, Jason, to play devil's advocate, what do you think Boris is doing wrong? What has he done wrong to arrive at the state he's in right now?
I'd just turn that question on its head. What's he done right in the last year or two? Goodness me. I mean, we can...
Well, he threw a few good parties. People had some great fun on Downing Street during the lockdowns.
Surprisingly, that hasn't proved to be a vote winner. People aren't impressed with the parties he's been throwing. Boris Johnson has thrown all of his principles out of the window in the time that he's been Prime Minister. He used to call himself a libertarian. He very clearly is not a libertarian anymore. It's unclear what the party stands for. Part of that is inevitable because they've been in government for so long now. But I think what we need is for the Tories at some point, whether they're in or out of government, to have a really serious think about what we stand for, what do we believe in, what are we actually here for? Because until they do that, they don't have a hope of winning over people's hearts and minds in any way other than relying on the fact that Keir Starmer won't win over people's hearts and minds himself. Since Brexit was enacted, which of course that's the reason they won the last election. They won a 5-year democratic mandate, but Brexit only took a month and a half to implement. after the election. Since then, they've not really had anything they've stood for. They've not had anything that inspires passion, and that's what they badly need if they want to keep achieving things rather than just staying in government for the sake of it.
And I'm assuming, Jason, that that's why an increasing number of Tory MPs, some of them rather senior and influential, are growing tired of Boris Johnson, because all he seems to do is to lurch from one crisis to the next, constantly firefighting and never actually doing anything politically.
Exactly right. Yeah, all this opposition that's coming out within the Tory party against Boris Johnson. It's amazing the wide range of different types of Tory MPs who are coming out against him. There's no organised campaign, like I said, like there was with Theresa May, but you've got Andrea Leadsom recently. You've got various people from the One Nation group, people from all different parts of the party who appear to have very little in common in terms of what they want the Tory party to be, what ideology they want to see the government espousing. The one thing they have in common is that they don't believe in Boris Johnson's leadership. And so that's the one thing he manages to unite his enemies in smashing his incompetence, because he's just unable to lead Number 10 and control his own staff, let alone set a convincing policy direction for the country.
I do wish, Peter, we're going to go to break fairly soon, so keep your answer short, but I do wish that there was something slightly more explosive about Keir Starmer, because Jason is articulating frustrations that people like me and lots of other people, shall we say, not quite from the left side of the fence, feel about Boris Johnson. And if I was Keir Starmer, I'd be jumping from the rooftops, shouting about this chaotic man who somehow is failing to lead our country properly. Why is Keir not managing to deliver that message successfully?
Well, I think he is delivering it because he's been ahead in nearly every poll this year, but he certainly needs to do a lot more, and yeah, he'd be right not to get caught up in temporary opinion polling. But I think his strengths, as we said earlier, of honesty, decency, being a bit stolid, actually they're the right strengths now. When we've had Brexit, we're coming out of COVID, we're still on the brink of essentially all-out war in Europe, and you've got a chaotic Prime Minister, so he's probably got the right characteristics for the national crises we're facing at the moment.
OK, we're going to go to break now. I'm still with Peter Edwards and Jason Reed. I'm Kevin O'Sullivan. This is Talk TV, live from the Talk Radio studio. Welcome back. We're having our political panel. I am with, in the studio, Peter Edwards. He's the former editor of Labour List. And by the magic of Zoom, political commentator Jason Reed. Welcome back, guys. Let's talk about women, penises, the trans issues. I don't want to go into specific details, Peter, but why? It's not just Labour politicians. The Tories have had their problems with this. In fact, all politicians. Why are they tying themselves up in knots over the definition of a woman?
Well, I think some politicians are tying themselves in knots and trying to give very nuanced answers, and they may be doing that out of sensitivity and compassion, which is correct. I think there's others who are not tying themselves in knots, and they're shooting from the hip, and they're taking a very firm stance in the culture wars. And I can understand both sides, but I guess what I really want to see is trans people treated with compassion, whatever one's view of the policy issues surrounding them. I think voters also want to see people provide a straight answer to a straight question.
Yeah, and the straight answer to the question, can you define a woman? It's a female adult human. Why can't politicians just say that? That is not transphobic. That is to say that people born with penises, are male. If they want to adjust that through their lives, go right ahead.
Well, Tony Blair said recently that Labour should, in the trans debate, rather than walk around it, get right in the middle of the debate and take on the issues. And I think probably there's some truth in that. What I'd say is you can't lump politically trans people into one group. Just like if you talk to any representative of the gay community, you'll get a range of views about LGBTQ plus issues. So I think Labour and all politicians, frankly, need to reach out more to trans groups and then allow that to help form their policy, rather than politically maintaining his distance, and that leads to what you kind of described as these quite nervous, caveated answers by politicians. But at the end of the day, elections crystallise a lot of things, whether it's on spending plans, coalition of the SNP or not, and tax. And however nuanced the question is from Dominic Raab or Keir Starmer now, they're going to have to come up with something a bit simpler by polling day.
Jason, if the Tories went into the next election carrying banners saying a woman is an adult female human, do you think it would be a vote winner?
I think it would, and it's incredible, I think, that the Labour Party is committing electoral suicide in this way. We've been talking already about how much further in the polls ahead they should be than the Tories, especially given the cost of living crisis, but they keep scoring own goals and leaving open goals for the Tories to score, such as Dominic Raab in this latest interview making a very simple statement about women and penises and having a huge surge of support from the Tory grassroots and other voters as well. I think it's remarkable that Labour thinks it is achieving something somehow, or helping trans people, or helping someone by consistently saying things that they have not properly thought through. And I agree partially with what Peter was saying. I think if the Labour Party wants to get involved in this issue, the best thing it could do would be to find out what actually are the relevant issues that people who are affected by this issue care about. For example, I don't think that if you did a survey of trans people in Britain and said, what's the political issue you care most about, that many of them would say, well, I think it's terribly important that people should be allowed to switch from a male to female prison at will, which is what Dominic Raab was referring to because he's the Justice Secretary. And so for the Labour Party to keep staking its flag in these issues that are only going to hurt it in the polls and only keep it away from power where it can do things that presumably it believes are good, it's very bizarre that they keep shooting themselves in the foot in this way when there's really no need for it.
I don't think that's the case at all, by the way. First of all, I joined the Labour Party more than 20 years ago. I've been out campaigning. I've never once been asked on the doorstep about trans issues, but I do completely agree it's an important public policy debate. But secondly, I think if Labour's perhaps, or the Labour leader rather, is a bit slow to set out a position, that's born out of compassion and sensitivity, because so many parts of this debate are not compassionate or sensitive. They're febrile and angry and occasionally name-calling.
Fair enough, but interesting you say that. In 20 years of campaign, you've never been asked about trans issues. Do you think that last weekend when Stella Creasy came out with her assertion that a woman can have a penis, that it might have been a bit more useful to the Labour Party if she'd have come out with, I don't know, some serious suggestions about how we could tackle the cost of living crisis? Because as you say, or as you imply, outside of the fashionable London bubble, I suspect the trans issue is not of preeminent importance to most of the people in this country. They're worried about the cost of living.
No, but I think I've no problem with what Stella Creasy said at all. I think
I'm not saying I've got a problem with it. I'm just saying that perhaps
or the choice of subject.
It doesn't go. I mean, I don't agree with her, but it doesn't go to the heart of what's worrying the people of Britain right now. It's a Hampstead and Islington issue.
Oh no, I'd question that a lot. I think absolutely it's a job of Labour Party to talk about marginalised issues. And if you think about gay rights in the 80s, if you think about racial equality, if you think about the treatment of women from the subcontinent at Grunwick in the 1960s, it's absolutely the place of the Labour Party to talk about marginalised groups, people that face bigotry. So I think Stella Creasy is completely right to speak out on it, even while we recognise the two biggest debates in the country are Ukraine and cost of living.
I don't want to be too cynical, but there are no votes in marginal groups, are there? Or there are very few groups. So it's a nice thing to say, but it won't get you elected.
Oh, no, I think that's nonsense, actually. We all care about all sorts of things, even if they don't affect us directly. To take the most febrile example in my whole life, millions of people had a strong view on the war in Iraq, despite never being to Iraq, having no Iraqi relatives, never planning to go there ever. I don't think you have to have a direct link to an issue personally to care about it. So I think Stella Creasy is right to raise something that comes up frequently in broadcast studios, even if it's something I've not experienced particularly on the doorstep.
I mean, you're not a Labour supporter, Jason, but would you prefer that Her Majesty's opposition dwelt on the big issues like the cost of living crisis rather than whether or not a woman can have a penis?
I think it's a fun thought experiment to think just how far Labour could be ahead in the polls if they actually talked about issues that people very obviously care about more urgently, like the cost of living crisis, rather than this kind of thing. And there's a clear contradiction, I think, in what you were saying, Peter, because on the one hand, you're saying this is a marginalised and important issue, and it's very important that people like Stella Creasy say the things they've said in that quite haphazard way. But on the other hand, Keir Starmer is some kind of hero for not daring to touch the subject just in case he says the wrong thing. I think you're giving too much ground to Keir Starmer there. I think it's pretty obvious that the reason he's not saying anything on this subject is because he doesn't want to tread on a landmine. He doesn't want to annoy one side or the other, not because he cares about sensitivity and compassion on either side of this debate.
I don't accept that at all. I think the top two issues in the country are inflation and Ukraine. But I think, think about how Labour has intervened in social debates over the last 50 years. Labour's always been the party that speaks with sensitivity and compassion, and that's why you end up with Tories delivering things like Section 28. Keir Starmer's right to choose his words carefully.
Thank you very much, Peter Edwards, former editor of Labour List, and Jason Reed, political commentator. We are going to be covering the travel chaos fairly soon. It certainly is a scene of chaos. And